Okay, everybody, welcome again. And I look forward to what I think will be an awesome program this afternoon. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Kevin Hine. I'm a partner here at Alexius in Denver, and I am pleased and honored to be your moderator for today's program. Before we get going, I'm going to ask anybody who may not have muted their microphone to please mute. We will have the opportunity to ask questions as part of the program, but we're going to use the chat feature, and that way we don't have to worry about background noise and kids walking in the door and everything else. So, by the way, when we do the if you do have questions, please direct your questions to the organizer, which will direct the questions directly to us here in Denver. I want to welcome everybody to our program this afternoon, especially those of you who've joined us from the East Coast. I realize we are perilously close to cocktail time, so we will do our best to make sure that we cover the topic as quickly as possible and let you get on with your afternoons or evening. Let me give you a little bit of a background on the origin of this program. And for those who might be joining us again today to hear updates, much of what you're hearing is going to be a repeat from our program on Tuesday, but we thank you for joining us again anyway. This program is called the Franchising in Crisis Program. It is actually a part of a series that we're running out of Denver. We have historically run a franchise executive forum on a monthly basis. And since we can't get everybody together, we decided we would do this over a webinar, and we've now expanded that guest list. So all of you who are on the program will actually be invited to attend what we anticipate will be weekly conference calls on topics that are really important to those of us in the franchise community. This program, in addition to being hosted and sponsored by Alexius, is also sponsored by Armanino and the folks from Blue Rock Consulting in Florida. So I thank our sponsors. I also want to acknowledge that we have a whole host of folks on this conference call today who come at this from various different perspectives. We have franchisors and maybe one or two franchise owners. We have some independent business operators that have heard about the conference and have asked to join us. We have a handful of franchise suppliers, and then we have probably one or two people who are just generally curious to know about how these programs work. So I welcome you all. As you heard at the beginning, this program is being recorded. We will make this available on our website and on the website of Handbrake Solutions and the DC Free Franchise Group, who are the speakers today. I think I want to end before I turn the floor over to our first presenter with a note.
This conference will now be recorded.
Okay. We're back on the microphones. At any rate, before I turn this over, I just want to make a quick observation, which is that this crisis is presenting a real opportunity for those of you in franchising for system-wide cooperation and collaboration. And a couple of the programs we're going to talk about today specifically offer opportunities for franchisors to step up and help their franchisees in ways that don't necessarily require franchisors to lay dollars out of their own personal accounts out the door, but instead provide resources to franchisees who, as we know, are in many cases really struggling with these mandatory shutdowns. We have an excellent group of presenters today. Ken Tyra, who is our CEO from Alexius, will give you a brief legal overview. And then Reg Bird from DCV Franchise Group is going to talk about these various loan and stimulus programs. And finally, John Sanderson from Handbrake Solutions will talk to you about strategies for obtaining rent relief for those of you who are in the business of retail or restaurants. With that, I am going to turn the floor over to Ken Tyra, our Chief Executive Officer. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Ken Tyra, as Kevin pointed out, and I'm the CEO of Alexius Solutions, which is a law firm that does quite a bit of work for small businesses, including franchises. It's been quite a month, quite a week. I've been a lawyer, an entrepreneur, and a business executive for over 35 years. I thought I'd seen it all, but I have to say this situation is the ultimate nightmare scenario. I understand that we have a mix of franchisors, franchisees, and non-franchise business owners in this audience. I think we also have a landlord or two. Let's all remember that landlords are business people as well. We're going to try to be general enough to cover everyone who might be on this call, but there are obviously going to be some differences in approach depending on which category you fall into and what your circumstances are. I want to point out that during recent years, there's been a trend that lawyers don't like to admit. There's been a convergence of legal consulting, business consulting, financial consulting, tax consulting, and quasi-legal compliance administrative types of activities. Because of this crossover, it can be really hard for a business person to know who should be responsible for doing what for the business. This crisis has really brought the convergence trend to a head. Today, no one discipline can help you with all the things you need to do to weather this particular crisis. So we decided it was time to organize. And we did it in a hurry, and we're working against a moving target, so I apologize if we seem a little less polished than we usually are in things like this. We've brought together a multidisciplinary team today, and I'm happy to tell you that this team will be working together to provide assistance to those of you who want it after learning more about the opportunities, as well as learning the difficulties in trying to do it on your own. I think here's why many of you will need help here. Most of you have at least 6 primary concerns right now if you want to survive this situation and thrive after the crisis abates. First, for many of you, keeping your investors and your partners in check. Second, for some of you, keeping your non-government backed lenders under control. Third, for some of you, dealing with your existing SBA loans. Fourth, keeping your lease in place and on terms that you can live with. Fifth, keeping as many of your employees as you can, except perhaps for the ones that you would have gotten rid of anyway. Sixth, getting your hands on new sources of cash to help weather the storm in a way that won't cause you eternal grief. Many of you are franchisors. You franchisors sit in a unique position. Not only do you have to look out for your own financial situations, but the fact of the matter is that the financial situations of your franchisees are inextricably entwined with those of your company. So guiding franchisees to appropriate resources so that they can help themselves is a critical part of a franchisor's job right now. Of those 6 categories I mentioned, we're going to focus today primarily on 2 of them. First, keeping a lease, whether it's a franchisee's retail location or a franchisor's office or an office of a business, keeping that lease in place on acceptable terms. Secondly, getting your hands on new cash to weather the storm. I'll introduce the subject of loans and grants here, and then Reg Bird will tell you a lot more about them. The recently enacted 2020 coronavirus stimulus bill, which I think everyone probably now knows was called the CARES Act, offers some very appealing new alternatives to traditional SBA loan options that will be lifesavers for many businesses. These government-backed loan program options include the traditional ones like SBA S7A standard loans, SBA 7A small loans, and SBA express loans. Those range from $350,000 to $5 million. And then the newly created crisis loan options, including the economic injury disaster loans in the form that they used to have from the Katrina era. The CARES Act modified economic injury disaster loans, which we're going to refer to in this presentation as EIDLs, EIDLs. Again, those range from $25,000 to $2 million. There's a $10,000 emergency grant cash advance component with those right now. A third program, which has been in the news today and still seems to be having a little failure to launch issue, is the Paycheck Protection Program, which runs up to $10 million. And that one includes substantial loan forgiveness potential, including the loan amount being tied to payroll, health insurance, mortgage, rent, and utilities expense. There's a whole bunch of factors that affect the forgiveness amount itself. And finally, there are some subsidies for existing SBA loans. Again, those rules are fairly complicated and it will depend on your particular circumstances. These programs are all administered by the SBA, some in coordination with lenders. The rules are complicated. It's probably not for do-it-yourselfers in many cases. Depends on your situation. There are going to be a lot of applicants for these programs. We're learning some things today. I'm sure Reg will talk about that in terms of how lenders are prioritizing applicants. So timely funding will go to those who first submit a properly completed application for the correct program. If it's not done correctly with the help of an assistance team, such as the people you're going to be hearing from today, you may find your applications are hung up in red tape and there's no immediate funding forthcoming. I think Reg will explain more about that. As far as leases go, April 1st was truly April Fool's Day this year. Nobody knew what to do, landlords or tenants. However, there is precedent for how to deal with leases coming out of prior economic crises. You can simply choose not to pay your rent and see what happens. However, this comes with some downsides, such as loan cross defaults, interest, penalties, loss of renewal rights, and the like. John Sanderson will be giving you some insights as to what can be done about all this. Finally, I want to point out that one of the reasons for an interdisciplinary approach is that there's a strategic and practical intersection between lease modifications and loan programs available under the CARES Act. John will talk about what Handbrake Solutions is doing regarding leases. Handbrake will be coordinating those efforts with Reg's company, DCV Franchise Group, in what is intended to be as seamless a way as possible. So with that very long introduction and without further ado, I'm going to turn the mic over to Reg.
Okay, thank you, Ken. Am I live?
You are live.
Okay, great. Let's go ahead and move to my slide, if you would. Perfect. Thank you so much. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to be here today and to share with you folks just a very, very high level of what we've been seeing going on for the last few weeks. I'm not going to get extremely granular. I want to be careful not to overload you with information because we all have seen the internet and how much is out there, and it just becomes overwhelming and confusing. So as Ken indicated, talking to us, using our firm to help you navigate this process can be really a huge relief for you. I'm not in any way trying to sell what it is that we do. I'm not that kind of a person. To do that, I would just like to share that we're here to offer that guidance. At any rate, DCV Franchise Group has been in business for nearly 17 years now. I started the business in my home office, where I've now come back to my home office because of the stay-at-home rules that are in place. But through those years, we've worked with over 570 different franchise concepts, ranging from deals that are in size of 20,000 to nearly 30 million. I brokered hotels in the beginning of when we first started the company, representing investors in hotel transactions, and some of those deals were rather large. But over the years, we began working with other franchise concepts, and as I mentioned, now we've worked with over 570. We've placed nearly $2 billion in project financing over that time and helped thousands of folks realize the American dream, or help them expand and grow their enterprise, whatever the case might be. But love doing that and love helping people. That's what we're all about. If you want to move to the next slide, please. We're going to talk about the existing, well, now there's two existing, but the original SBA program that was released on March the 6th called the Economic Injury Disaster Loan Program. I call it EIDL for short. This SBA program has a loan amount of up to $2 million, and the term is based on the ability of the business to repay the loan. Before I go any further, just want to mention that this program in particular is processed and funded only by the SBA. There are no banks involved in this program. The use for operating funds for this program are for operational expenses such as interest on debt, accounts payable, payroll, rent, and utilities. That pretty much sums it up. The spirit of the program, as with the payroll protection program I'm going to talk about in a minute, is to help business owners keep the doors open and to retain their employees as best they can. It's to help the economy continue on as best it can, all things considered. But we need to keep in mind always that that is the spirit of these programs. Other recovery options need to be identified before accessing the EIDL program or applying. So in other words, if you have an insurance policy that might have a disaster clause in it where you might get some relief from your insurance company, that would need to be exhausted. The SBA is going to be looking for things such as that when they're examining your application. They want to be sure that this program is the last resort. And in most cases, it's the only resort. For this program now, there is no collateral required for loans that are less than $200,000. Anything over that, the SBA is going to be looking for any collateral that you have, and it must be pledged. So the collateral may be an asset of the business, and the equity, personal real estate, etc. But the SBA will definitely be looking for any collateral that might be out there for loans that are over $200,000. But it's a wonderful thing that there's no collateral required for loans less than $200,000. This is really a huge leap into the spirit of wanting to help businesses, because generally, and for most of my career in this business, the SBA has really been hung up on collateral in almost all cases. Personal guarantee is the same as the collateral rule above, which is there will be no personal guarantor required for loans that are less than $200,000. This too is a huge leap for the SBA to bypass that rule, because it too has always been a standard condition and requirement. It's important to keep all of the receipts that you have that can demonstrate what you've paid for using the funds from the EIDL program. It seems like common knowledge, but we sometimes get so caught up doing things, you might want to just get an envelope that you can drop your receipts into. So when and if the time comes that there's any kind of audit or request for information, you have that readily available. The term could be up to 30 years, depending on the size of the loan, and the interest for this program is capped at 3.75. I threw an extra little note in there that for nonprofit organizations, the interest is capped at 2.75. Ken, is there anything you'd like to add at this point, or otherwise we can go ahead and move on to the next slide?
Go ahead.
Okay, great. So let's go ahead and move on to the next one here. Okay, I'm going to go over what the 3 steps are for submitting your application. Number 1 is there is an online application you can go to where you can upload your documents that are required. The SBA has a list of what documents they want, and it's relatively easy from what I've seen and how far I've gone through it. This is the website or the URL and so forth for the most updated EIDL program application online. There was an application previously, but they did update it. So you want to make sure you're on the right one. Step 2 is that the SBA reviews your credit, and now one of the newer revisions and updates to this program is that the SBA could potentially approve you just based on your credit for the loan amount you're requesting. Otherwise, there is a $10,000 grant that would be given to you within 3 days of the SBA receiving your application. And this $10,000 grant is a given. It will happen, and it's not something you have to pay back. So it's very important to apply for the EIDL program. You really have nothing to lose except $2,500 that you pay us to help make sure that everything is submitted properly and is sped through first round. Getting back to step 2 a little bit. So if not approved by your credit immediately, you'll still get the $10,000 in 3 days, and the SBA examiner or whichever examiner is assigned to your file will arrive at a decision within 2 to 3 weeks as to whether you qualified for a loan or not. And they will contact you at that point that you are qualified, and they'll go over a few things with you, including your loan closing docs, which they'll send over to you, I would imagine, in DocuSign through the DocuSign platform. And then once you return your closing documents to the SBA, they will release the initial loan amount to you within 5 days. And they're going to be giving you lump sums of money through a period of time. They don't give it to you all at once. They determine with you how much you need for each week and so forth, and then they'll disperse the funds accordingly over the period of the initial time that you'll need the money. Step 3, I already went over this actually, the loan closing docs. The initial disbursement will be within 5 days. This comment here I've added about the eligibility for the $10,000 grant. Everybody is eligible who makes application and the application is complete. As I mentioned before, it's paid out within 3 days of the loan package review. Whether or not you receive the loan, the grant does not have to be paid back, providing it's used to retain employees. Now, I've put a note in here because it is reality. The feedback that we have been receiving is that the $10,000 grant is not actually being received within 3 days. It is taking longer. I just want to add that as a reality check, not to discourage anybody by any means, but it's just the reality, I think, of what's going on based on volume that the SBA has been receiving. Okay, Ken, unless you want to add anything that I might have missed, go ahead on to the next slide. There we go. So the CARES Act was signed into law Friday a week ago, and the CARES Act has 4 parts to it. We've made it our business to understand pretty much just one part of that CARES Act, which is the Paycheck Protection Program. This is the loan program that a lot of people are referring to. I even hear it on the news, the CARES Act loan program. I've heard a lot of different things that the program's been referred to, but it is called the Paycheck Protection Program, and sometimes you'll hear PPP. The businesses with sole proprietors, independent contractors, and other self-employed individuals are eligible for application, and anyone who has less than 500 employees, full-time, part-time, seasonal, etc., are eligible to apply, qualified to apply. Businesses that have been in operation as of February 15th, 2020, and the employees must have been paid since that time. So in other words, if you hired somebody on February 14th and you've not paid them yet for whatever reason, then that would disqualify the application. So I think enough time has passed that the employees who have been hired since that time have been paid. There is no collateral and no personal guarantee required for this program. And so unlike the EIDL program, there's no minimums or maximums. It's just no collateral and no personal guarantor. The loans can be, the loan amount can be up to 2 months of your average monthly payroll costs from the last year, plus an additional 25% of that amount. The payroll costs are defined as to include benefits, sick leave, family leave, state payroll taxes, and so forth. So there is a clear definition in the rules as to what is payroll cost. It's not just raw payroll dollars. There is a maximum of payroll cost that is $100,000. There have been a lot of questions about, well, if somebody's making $125,000, is the $100,000 the cap? Yes, it's the cap. If somebody is making $50,000, but they receive $50,000 in other benefits, whatever those might be, the cap can go up to $100,000. So I just want to hopefully make that clear, because there's been a great deal of confusion about that. It's best just to keep in mind the cap is $100,000. Funds are for coverage through June 30th of 2020. So if you apply, for example, on May the 1st, 2020, you'll receive funding that will be for your business through June the 30th. Now, interesting, just last night, while some of us were sleeping, the interest rate went to 1%. When we all went to bed last night, it was 0.5%. So it's 1% as of this morning, and the term is for 2 years. It's a little typo there, but the term is for 2 years. Okay. We'll go ahead and jump to the next slide. So the payroll protection program can be used for the following, and it's very specific in the rules. Payroll costs, including benefits, which I kind of touched on a minute ago, interest on mortgage obligations incurred before February 15th, rent under lease agreements enforced before February 15th, and utilities for which service began before February 15th. It's very specific about what the funds can be used for. Something to keep in mind, a little tidbit of information that could end up being very useful, is that if you apply for the EIDL program and the payroll protection program, and you receive money from both, you cannot use money that comes from the EIDL for the same things you're going to use the protection program for. In other words, you cannot commingle the funds. So you need to pick what you're going to use the EIDL money for, and then that's set aside, and now you can use the payroll protection program funds for these other things. Now you can also use the EIDL program for payroll, but you just have to be careful that if you use the EIDL funds for employee number 1, you cannot use the payroll protection program also for employee number 1. So you need to clearly delineate between those two programs and how you're spending the money. I might have mentioned this toward the beginning. I don't recall. I've done a few of these webinars, as you might imagine, over the last couple of weeks. But the EIDL program is funded and processed and funded only by the SBA. and the payroll protection program only by lenders. So the application for the PPP goes directly to lenders. It is strongly encouraged that you use the current lender who you have a relationship with. Even if you don't have a close relationship with a particular individual who is servicing your loan, doesn't matter. Still go to that bank and talk to them about the PPP program. We're happy to facilitate that program for you. Collect the documents. The list of documents required for this program has also been a moving target. Up until last night, same kind of thing as with the interest. There was a list of documents required, and as of this morning, that list of documents increased, and they've added more. Some banks might have a requirement for an additional document or two that the PPP program doesn't require, but that's just the bank's policy. But regardless, these programs have been streamlined to get past any red tape or bureaucracy or slowing things down. They're put together so that they can move quickly. Go ahead and move to the next slide, please. The beauty of the PPP program is that there is loan forgiveness. Now, it's a little tricky on how the loan forgiveness works, but the forgiven amount, I'll just read through this, and I think we'll be sharing the slides with you so you can look at this a little bit more closely. The loan forgiveness amount will be equal to the amount actually paid for payroll, salaries, benefits, rent, utilities, and mortgage interest during the 8-week period following the disbursement of the loan. The forgiveness amount is subject to reduction, in other words, not as much forgiveness, if there's been a workforce reduction or a reduction in the salary or wages of an employee. Now, for some this will work, for some it won't, but basically this is going back to the spirit of the program, which is to encourage businesses to keep their doors open and to retain their employees and to continue to pay them what they had been getting paid before. That seems very unlikely in so many of the cases that I hear, but you want to do your best to try and make that happen. If you can't meet exactly the retention of employees that you had, the calculation for the forgiveness will be based on what you could do. So it's not that the forgiveness will be forgotten, so to speak. The forgiveness calculation will take that into account as to what you've been able to do. Reductions in workforce salaries and wages that occur from February 15, 2020 to April 26, 2020 will be disregarded for purposes of reducing the forgiveness amount, so long as the reductions are eliminated by June 30th. So what this is saying is that if you're able to bring back and rehire and pay again employees who you've let go or had to terminate or put on, laid them off or put them on furlough or whatever the case might be, if you bring them back by June 30th and put them back on payroll, then that's going to help tremendously in getting up to 100% loan forgiveness. One thing I want to mention too is that these two programs can actually work together. So I kind of alluded to that already. I spoke about earlier, make sure what you use the EIDL money for is different than what you use the PPP money for. If you apply for the PPP program and are approved for a loan, you can actually roll your EIDL money that you've received into the PPP loan. and actually do away with the EIDL loan altogether. Now you only have one loan, it's the PPP loan, and now whatever money you've received from the EIDL program that's been rolled into the PPP can be part of the loan forgiveness calculation, is now part of the 1% interest rate instead of 3.75, and so forth. So that's a tremendous benefit that I really want folks to know about, is that you can roll your EIDL money into the PPP program and then be able to enjoy all the benefits that the PPP program offers. Go ahead and jump to the next slide. I think this is just contact information for us, if I'm not mistaken. Or it's introducing John. So
Yeah, we have contact information for everybody on the program at the end. We
must have been one
have,
of those other webinars I was doing. I'm sorry.
that's totally okay. We can open up for questions now. If anybody wants to ask questions about these programs, if you use the chat button, you should be able to ask us any questions. If we don't have questions, we can move on. We can move on to John's presentation, but send your chat questions to the organizer. Wow, this is a quiet group. We must have had like 36 questions the other day. All right, we'll take questions.
Window.
What's that? Was that you, John?
I would say that looks like there might be some in the chat window.
One of the questions is
Okay.
from a friend of mine, actually. You want to take that, Kevin?
The one about not being able to apply for both loans?
Right.
Yeah, I think, well, I mean, you just basically said that they can apply for both loans, and you explained how that they work together. So I think the answer is yes, you can apply for both loans, and you can get them to work interchangeably. Is that a fair statement, Reg?
Interchangeably, I'd be a little bit careful with. I'm certainly not an attorney, but I think that it needs to be clear that by interchangeable, just be careful that you're using the EIDL money for one thing and the PPP money for something else. And the other part of that would be that you can roll the EIDL program money, the EIDL funding, into the PPP funding. Now, this question might have come about, Kevin, because at one time, the rule was that when the PPP program rolls out, which applications started being accepted today, so let's say maybe a week ago, I think it was, the rule was you were not going to be able to apply for both. You would end up having, if you applied for the EIDL, you would not be able to apply for the PPP. That rule changed. So obviously, by things I've said, you clearly apply for the EIDL and the PPP.
Okay, thank you, Reg. Speaking of rule changes, we have a second question about the factor, the payroll factor for the PPP. This question says, I've heard it's 2.5 times your payroll, but today it is 2.25 times.
2.25 actually as of yesterday. Yeah, 2.25 as of yesterday morning.
Okay, so 2.25 is the rule, at least for the next 10 minutes, right?
Exactly. That's pretty well put. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think it's really worth emphasizing to everybody on this call. I have never seen a set of programs that have been so much in flux. I've never seen Congress pass a law and then have an administrative agency seemingly change the terms of the law at will. And so I think we're going to see a lot of flexibility, and that's a very kind use of the word, over the next several days to maybe a couple weeks as everybody tries to figure this out. But I think the change of the 2.5 to 2.25 is a good example, because I believe the 2.5 was in the law, was in the statute. Right. So right. If somebody else is changing it, they're changing it sort of outside the bounds of the legislative process.
And you know, on that note, Kevin, we have lender relationships to nearly 100, and we're actively working with 15 to 20 lenders on any given day. I think we have a lot of lender relationships, but the lenders who we have been talking to, especially today, but through the course of the week since the law was passed for the PPP, have been very frustrated. Now, I'm not saying all of them, but the majority of them have been very frustrated with the PPP program for reasons being that which Kevin just stated. There's been so much this and that and back and forth. It's been extremely difficult to keep on top of what's going on. So, again, just mentioning that we're here to lead, guide, and direct to make sure that we relieve the stress and the burden of having to figure out what the rule is today versus yesterday or what's going to happen tomorrow. We've made it our business to stay on top of what's going on as best we can and to make the process seamless for you. It's pretty simple. We tell you, here are the docs we need. Being part of the firm that we are, we've got nearly 500 employees and we have CPAs and so on and so forth. We are under very strict regulations and having to do with confidentiality. So you're able to upload your documents to us securely and safely to the extent possible. And we audit the documents you send us to make sure that the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed. And then we're prepared to make application. We have lenders, as I mentioned, who we know and are involved in this program, who we will submit directly to, who will process. So yeah, we're here for you to definitely make it a much easier process for you.
Reg, this is Ken. I do have a question for you. The program obviously has its limits in terms of what's been funded. And since it's being passed through lenders, I'm assuming that lenders are going to establish their own limits in terms of how much funding they will provide and rely on government support for. Is that accurate?
That is accurate. Very fair statement, yes. And in fact, we've had comments that lenders are prioritizing the files that they begin processing first based on the loan amount, because the banks are getting paid by the SBA to process these, but it's broken down. The percentage of the loan amount that the banks are getting is broken down into different categories based on loan amount. So that's something I'm hesitant to share. But on the other hand, getting back to reality, I think it's important to understand to maybe avoid frustration that might come about is that you might run into a bank who says, you know what, your loan amount isn't very big, so we're going to probably put you at the bottom of the stack. And that literally happened. There's a gentleman who owns an ice cream shop in Carlsbad here in Southern California. We did the financing for him a little over 7 years ago. Poor fella, he just paid off his SBA loan 2 years ago. Thought it was done. Then all of this hit, and now he's gone to his bank to apply for the PPP. And that's exactly what the bank told him was, oh my gosh, your loan amount really isn't much. We're going to kind of push you toward the bottom of the stack.
So, Reg, second question.
I don't want to leave on a sour note.
Yeah, second question for me, which relates to it, and it's just reality. This is Ken again, if the initial funding for this program runs out, if another stimulus package of similar nature isn't passed to refund it or to add funding to it, and given that priorities seem to be going to existing customers of banks, particularly existing customers who have a large loan need, what are the risks that if you're not early in the queue here, you're going to have a problem? I mean, should anyone rely on this PPP program is, I guess, my question, until they actually have the money in hand?
Well, I think the simple answer to that is apply now, get in, because the money will run out. The CARES Act is the third phase of what the government is doing to help what's going on in general. Like the first phase was to fund the CDC to help them in finding a cure, making sure they had adequate liquidity to get what they needed to do. The second phase was the economic injury disaster loan program, the EIDL program I've been talking about. That was the second phase. And then the third phase was, as of last Friday, signed into law, the CARE Act, which is the PPP program. Are they working on a fourth phase? I can't say for sure. That's not something I've, quite frankly, even looked up. I've been so busy, but could be that they are. But regardless, we don't know what it is, what the restrictions will be, what the amounts allowed will be. The most important thing is to get application in to both of these programs and get what you can get to help you keep your doors open.
So we have another question. What documents are going to be required for the PPP loan? Do you have a good sense of that, John? We're not Reg.
I was gonna say,
Yeah.
John?
Yeah, sorry. It
That's
is Sunday
I can tell you,
afternoon
but I have to
every.
call Reg first.
Oh, Reg has a lot of stories, and he could tell one right now about his grandson, but that's okay. Anyhow, what was the question, Kevin? I'm sorry. I blanked out there.
Generally, what documents are going to be required for a PPP loan?
The documents, of course. We have a very good idea of what documents are going to be required, such as your 941s, your payroll reports and so forth, as well as tax returns and that kind of thing. We have a very good sense of what documents are required. We've talked to several lenders who've given us their lists of what are required. So when we work with you to collect your documents, you can rest assured that we're going to collect everything that we're going to need. We're not going to miss anything if that is a concern at all.
But to be clear, there's no definitive list yet, right? There's no place that you can go. I mean, what you're saying is you've got a sense from the lenders you've worked with, but lenders are probably going to have different, slightly varying lists based on their own requirements. And as far as I've seen, there's no list that's published from, say, the SBA or anybody at the government level that says here are all the documents that you need. Correct?
That's correct. I have about a half a dozen different lists that I reference, and none of them are the same, sadly.
Do you know if somebody has a relationship with the bank and they're interested in working with that bank for purposes of a PPP loan, are these banks generally willing to make their own document lists available to their customers or prospective borrowers?
Yes, they are.
Okay. So I think the answer then is probably anybody who has an existing relationship with a bank, since it makes the most sense to go to your bank as a starting point, ask them for the list, because that will be the list that they'll be working off of. Of course, it's always subject to change. Do we have any other questions before we move on to John's part of the presentation?
I'm just going to add something. This is Ken, as we close the loan part of this, which is, as I pointed out, there's an interrelationship between a number of laws relating to the loan rescue packages and your lease situation, and frankly, the unemployment laws in each state are different, and we're not yet sure how they're going to play together here. What effect will the forgiveness of debt be on, say, your unemployment requirements in the future? What will that affect other things? For instance, if you take an EIDL loan, we believe that it's possible that you're going to lose some credits that you might otherwise receive. There's a bunch of government laws that exist on the books that haven't been all pulled together. So just be aware that when you go forward to these programs, you're moving forward to try to get cash in hand, but you might not always know all the implications right off the bat. As we gather that information at Alexius, we're going to be trying to disseminate that information, and people can, it'll help inform their decisions on what kind of money to get, where to get it from, and how it relates to their other decisions.
Good
All right, we
point.
had another question coming in. It says, theoretically, you don't, this is more of a comment. Theoretically, you don't need documents to apply, but it sounds like lenders are trying to cover their butts. Definitely. You have to certify that your payroll reporting is accurate. And that is actually a good observation as well. Then I do think that even though in theory documents aren't required, there's no question that lenders are going to build files because they don't want to be held responsible. I mean, there was a big article or big discussion this morning on one of the news shows about fraud and what the risks are that either people that aren't entitled to the money because their companies are too big are going to be going after this money, or people are going to create non-existent entities so that they can get their hands on their money. And I'm sure that will occur in both instances. So lenders obviously going to be as careful as they can be to document so that if fingers get pointed, they're arguably not going to be pointed at the lender.
That's a
Let's
really
go on
good
with
I'm glad you brought that
go ahead.
up. There was, oh, did I interrupt somebody?
No, go ahead.
Thank you. I had a phone call with a prospect the other day who was really focusing on how he could get his hands on some of this money to help him grow his existing business that was doing fine, but he wanted to grow his enterprise. And I just had to keep recalling to him the spirit of this program. These programs are to help business owners keep their doors open, for crying out loud. Keep as many employees on as you can. It's not about growing your business at this time. There are other SBA loan programs that are available for that, but not these two.
Excellent point. All right, we're going to move this on. John, I'm going to turn the floor over to you. You can talk about rent relief.
Excellent. Thanks, Kevin. Thank you all for joining today. My name is John Sanderson. I've been in the commercial real estate business for a little over 10 years. Before that, 14 years with Microsoft and IBM in business development. You know, I negotiate for a living, and I think that in these uncertain times, tenants and franchisees that are tenants certainly need all the extra help they can get. I want to start by just telling a little personal story. I've been through this sort of thing before. In 2001, I was highly leveraged. We had businesses in 2 different states, and 9/11 occurred. And of course, for those of you that were in business back then, you know that really everything dried up. It's not unlike what's happening now. In many, many ways. The problem was I was young and I didn't know any better. And so, like so many tenants, I just kept paying my bill. Midwest boy, grew up, obligations were number one. If you said you were going to do it, your word was your bond. You signed your hand to the contract, you have to pay. Well, what ended up happening over several months, I paid my rent to my apartment, I paid my car payments, but I paid my lease to my landlord in 2 different states. I paid my equipment leases to whoever it was I bought my equipment from. And I continued to pay because that's what I thought I was supposed to do. And then one day I woke up and I had no money left. I had a young infant daughter, now 20, but at the time only 2, little over under 2, I guess. And my wife and I, we couldn't buy groceries. We couldn't buy groceries. We couldn't buy diapers. And I fear, honestly, in my soul, I fear that that's what's going to happen to some of these franchisees because they're scared to have a conversation with their landlord about how they can work out their plan. As a side note, you know, none of this is their fault, as you all certainly know. Nobody planned for it. a lot of these folks literally operate their business month to month, and those of you that are in the restaurant business, I was told the other day that a lot of single unit restaurant operators only have 16 or 18 days worth of cash flow. So these people are in real trouble, and we want to help. We formed Handbrake separate from my normal real estate business to stand up a unique entity, this multidisciplinary group of people to try to help put this in perspective. I want to find a way to help these people because most of them simply do not have a plan. So here's what we propose to do. Right now, I'm literally talking to, 10 or 15 landlords a day about existing clients of mine. And I've loosely bucketed these conversations into, 3 categories. The landlords that are super proactive, that are coming to the tenants and saying, we know this is bad, we don't know when it's going to end, so we're willingly going to give you some rent relief. Whether that's free rent or deferred rent, I think it's a bit of a mixed bag. There's kind of the middle group that are saying, yeah, we're going to think about it. Go ahead and pay your rent in April, and we're going to think about it and get back to you. And then there's another group that are much more merciless that say, absolutely not. You have a contract. You have to pay. And I'll be darned, but the tenants are paying. They're taking their hard-earned cash and they're paying. And they're not going to be able to pay month after month and come out at the other end of this with a viable business plan. I mean, I'm sure you've all thought about this. You're business owners yourselves. If you keep paying all of the expenses at full price with zero income, at some point in time, the cash will run out. I want to be able to get in front of these people, the landlords and the tenants, and have a conversation about a rent relief program that makes sense, that creates a win-win scenario, because the opportunity is here for everybody to work together. I read a great article this morning on I think it was a Denver Business Journal. The CEO of Snooze Restaurants said a dead tenant is no good to anyone. And ain't that the truth? Not only will the tenant be broke and broken, the landlord will have a vacant spot. They'll have legal action. They'll go months with no more revenue. I mean, I think some of these landlords just aren't taking the long view. And when we start talking about ways to work it out, I think the benefits become apparent. If the landlord will work with us to create an environment where the tenant can come out the other side with cash in hand to rehire and restock and reopen and remarket, they have a far better chance of a long-term relationship that actually works out. As you've heard Reg talk about funding from the government, I think that we can successfully negotiate something between 90 and 180 days, probably something like 120 is the most likely. I'd like to think that we can use part of the CARES Act money to help pay rent for 2 months, and then have another 2 months of deferred, reduced, pick an adjective that sounds good, and let's go negotiate it. We've put together an amendment, a proactive amendment, just to get the conversation started, which I think we can get in front of these landlords. There's a couple of other things that I feel very strongly about, in part from my personal story and in part by what I see on the street every single day now. When the tenant sort of takes direction from the landlord remains in control. And I'm not trying to talk about confrontational control. I'm talking about control of what's going to happen next. If the tenant speaks up, sends a note, makes a phone call, sends a proposed amendment, they're really taking charge of what's going to happen next. Further, I think we all know we're in the contract business. Memorializing the agreement is super important, because people forget that we agreed to this or that. And this could go on for quite some time. We may have to go back to the well again and ask for more. In fact, and I'm not exaggerating, literally just as we've been on this call today, Dallas County, metropolitan Dallas, Texas, is on a stay-at-home order now until May 20. So whatever expectation people might have had in Dallas that they were going to reopen in May, it's pretty much gone until the 1st of June now. So anybody that was negotiating 1 month of free rent or 1 month of deferred rent in Dallas County is going to have to start thinking about a second or a third month. So let us have the tough conversations with the landlord. Ken pointed out, I don't know, a week or so ago when we first started talking about this, and I was asking his opinion about, is it better for me to supply the docs to the tenant or to have the conversation on behalf of the tenant? And very wisely pointed out that sometimes the tenant and the landlord have a personal relationship, not just because they see one another, perhaps weekly, certainly maybe monthly or semi-annually, but they have a relationship. And that relationship, because it's familial in nature, the nature of it is familial, it gets difficult, I think, for people to have that hard conversation. It's a little bit humiliating to go ask your landlord to not take any rent. Even harder to admit that you don't have an unlimited supply of cash in your accounts to pay through this whole thing. So I think taking that burden off the tenant, off the franchisee, and putting it on someone like us to have that more professional brokerage to landlord conversation makes it better for everybody involved. Some of the benefits, I think, that are not necessarily apparent is in negotiating an amendment to the lease that talks about deferred rent or free rent. We also avoid some of the pitfalls of the default clauses within those leases. No default rent, no late fees, no acceleration. You heard Ken talk about cross default of loans. Well, leases are not that much different. If a landlord wants to play hardball and you don't pay for 30 days, conceivably they could begin the process of eviction, although certainly unlikely. The government is not going to come in and amend your lease for you. You're going to have to do that yourself, or you're going to have to work with someone like us to do that. I think the other thing that's probably true, and that I think a lot of people don't consider, is that when you're in a 20,000 square foot building or a 50,000 square foot building or a mall for that matter, that landlord is getting a call from every single tenant about their rent right now. And some of those people are being proactive, but I suspect the lion's share are not being proactive. That is to say, the tenants are just saying to the landlord, what am I going to do? How are you going to help me? Well, I think we've turned that around and we say, here's what we propose, and here's an amendment that we like that spells out all the things that we want to work out with you, Mr. Landlord or Miss Landlord. So I think we'll have a little leg up on that aspect as well. The tenants, they have to spend their money wisely. We're going to charge for this service, very modest fee, $1,995 for a unaffiliated brand. And then if a franchise brand comes to us and says, hey, will you look after our whole system, we'll drop that price down by 25%. I think it's a win-win for everybody. We're probably going to have 5 to 10 hours per engagement. No disrespect to our legal friends on the phone, but I think we're going to be a lot less expensive than hiring a lawyer to do this kind of conversation. It makes a lot of sense. We'd like to think that they're investing with us in order to buy a very reasonable amount of rent relief in the form of 90, 120 or more days. In fact, we're so confident that this is a good deal for everybody that if we can't get the tenant more than 90 days, we'll refund their money. So here's how we think we're going to do it. And this is what we expect to bear out over time. I'm a strong negotiator and I'm going to go in hard and I want to say to the landlord, hey, we want 150 or 180 days, because I honestly think there's 2 phases to this coronavirus shutdown across the world. There's this initial phase where we're closed and we don't know when we're going to reopen, and that reopen date is very fluid. You could pick July 1st as a date and it may slide into August, or you could pick June 1st and it could slide in July. Pick a couple of dates. It doesn't really matter. But ultimately, I think we have to be very, very conservative about how long it's going to take for this whole business to clear out. And that's just to reopen. That's not to get back to 10% of sales or 50% of sales or 100% of sales, which could take months longer. We just don't know. So let's be conservative. Let's negotiate hard. Let's get as much time either free or deferred as possible. We think 2 months of that will come from these government programs. We think that the tenant will be able to take part of the CARES money and apply it direct to their initial 2 months of rent. That will appease the landlord. I think we put that into the amendment, so we're memorializing it. And then we're asking the landlord to forgive or defer additional rent over time, whether that is amortizing it over a period of time or simply pushing it to the end of the lease. Every landlord, I think, will approach that differently. So that's the plan. So what's next? What's next? If you're interested, we're happy to do this talk one-on-one with your franchisees. That is to say that you could schedule a call, and Reg and I, or somebody from Reg's office and I, will be happy to present direct to them. You can go crazy and just send them all to the handbrakesolutions.com website, fill out the loan and landlord forms, and we can engage with them directly. But we want to get started because I think time is of the essence here. If people haven't already paid rent in April, they're certainly in the sleepless night phase about whether they should or should not pay, or how much they should or should not pay, or whatever they're going to do. And once again, from our perspective, we want to make it a win-win for everybody involved. So if we can't get 90 days or more in deferred rent one way or another, we're going to refund their money. We'll do the work anyway, but we'll give them their money back. So with that, I'm going to pause and see if there's any questions.
One question just came in. Will the government do anything to prevent my landlord from evicting me? What about late fees or default rent? That is an awesome question. And here's what I will tell you we're seeing on the legal end, and John, you can certainly chime in afterwards. There are some, mostly localities, like city level folks, that are dealing with moratoriums on eviction. But what we have seen so far is nothing more than an order that says that tenants, whether they're residential or retail, cannot be evicted for a certain period of time. There's nothing that is in any way modifying your lease agreement, which means that at the end of the moratorium, not only are you still subject to being evicted if you haven't paid your rent or worked out a deal with the landlord, there's nothing that prohibits the landlord from applying late fees, interest, default rent, etc.
This is Ken. I'm just going to step in. It really depends on the locality. In Los Angeles, for instance, the Mayor Garcetti's order precludes landlords from collecting late fees and late charges, but it really depends. So we can't say that definitively in every location you'd be stuck with them, but reality is you don't want to face an eviction if there's any way to work out an appropriate agreement that satisfies the needs of both sides. And truth be told, if I were a landlord and I'm facing potential default with my lender, I probably would want to at least establish what I'm able to do with my tenant so that I can adjust my pro forma according to a more appropriate payment schedule.
Yeah, I concur. And what I'm hearing from my clients who are tenants and a handful of real estate clients who are also landlords, everybody's rolling it up. The 5 people in my client Joe's building, they're all saying that they don't want to pay in April. Joe, in turn, is rolling that up to his bank. His bank, in turn, gave him 90 days forbearance on principal and interest payments, and they're tacking it on the end of the loan. So that makes Joe a really interesting example of what landlords could do, or probably should do, in order to help support their tenants. I mean, he's not a dumb guy. He knows what it takes for me to go lease out another retail space for him. And he knows that he's going to have to pay to gut that building. He knows it's going to be vacant for quite some time. And he knows he's going to have to pay real estate commissions again to relet the space. So it's better for him to give up 30, 60, 90, 120 days worth of rent to keep his tenant in business so that they can successfully relaunch, survive the crisis and go back into the pizza business or the haircut business or the whatever other business he has in that building. So I think it's a real problem for everybody. And, putting your head in the sand is not going to change it.
I do.
And any other questions?
We have another question that says, question about, I think this is a rate question. I see the rate is different for franchise systems, but how do I or we manage negotiations when every location has a different landlord and is a different situation? I'm assuming that is the perspective of maybe the franchisor, or is this a multi-unit franchisee? I think the answer to the question might be a little bit different depending upon that perspective.
It's by
Well,
location. My thought is you're charging by location, correct?
Yeah, we're charging by location. I think let's make it a little bit more clear. So what we're saying, we're opening this program up to more than just franchise clients, franchisors. Obviously, I have a fairly robust business already, and lots of those tenants are interested in help. So what we've said is we're going to have one price for people off the street, and then we're going to have one price for franchisors whose franchisees are interested. So your franchisees would still pay the $14.95 per location. So if you're a multi-unit operator, it's $14.95 per location. If you're a single unit, it's $14.95 per location. If you're not affiliated with a franchise brand, if you're the hair salon who I'm working with right now, who isn't a franchise, they're paying $19.95. So we're just trying to make it easier for franchisors to want to help their franchisees. The franchisee still has to pay the bill, but we're going to give you a discount because we're all in this together from a franchisee, franchisor, supplier perspective.
And I think the other part of the answer is that you do get economies of scale on a brand basis, partly by understanding how the brand works, and frankly, by getting some success in one area that you can use to leverage success with other landlords. I mean, the reality is if you're representing brand X and you get a certain amount of success right off the bat, you can go to other landlords and say, look, this is what other people are doing for this brand. And it will put some additional pressure on those folks, which will help facilitate the process and make it go a little faster.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, Kevin. I work with one franchise brand that I've been engaging with about 50 of their franchisee locations already. And, it's very nice to be able to say I represent the brand in this pursuit so that it's not a one-off. Maybe it's just my perspective, but the implication is, hey, we have buying power behind us and we're working on behalf of this brand for all of their locations across the country. It's a pretty powerful statement.
So John, I think that's a great point. Follow-up is, do you negotiate each location separately? Does your team?
I do, to the extent that, what's happening is these locations are coming in slightly disjointed. It's not as if the franchisor has sent me a list of every, Simon Properties location that they have and says, hey, can you negotiate this all at one time? We have had to go out to each individual lease, review the lease, the terms of the lease, create the amendment to match the lease timing, the date it was signed and all of the appropriate parties, and then go contact the landlord, the contact at the landlord individually on a per lease basis to be able to make sure we get the right kind of attention.
All right, I think we are at the point where people are running out of gas, and again, we are perilously close to cocktail hour in several time zones here. So we want to thank you all for your time and attention. We will be sending out a copy of the PowerPoint to everybody who participated, and frankly to the people that participated on Tuesday as well. I presume that by the time everything comes together, this will probably be early next week. So if there are updates that are material, we'll try and get them into the PowerPoints. So it could be slightly different from what you heard today. If the rules change again, as they likely will, but we'll try and give you the most accurate information. We'll also post a copy of this PowerPoint or the presentation at the Alexius website, at the Handbrake Solutions website, and at the DCV website. So if people want to come and listen to it again, that would be great. Finally, to make things probably as simple as possible for those of you on the call, if you want to have contact or if you want to reach out and start the process with either John or Reg, you can go to the Handbrake Solutions website, www.handbrakesolutions.com. Click on either the stimulus button or the rent relief button, the information requested, and someone will be in contact with you. If you're interested in both programs, be sure to click on both buttons. There is also if I can get the slide to move, contact information for Reg and John here. I'll give you a moment to write it down. You'll also get a copy of the slides. And then my information will be on the next slide. And you can contact Ken as well. So give everybody a chance to write that down. And then my information is here. Ken is actually ken.tyra at Alexius Solutions. And so we're available to take calls. We actually had a fair amount of follow-up from the program on Tuesday. So we are happy to answer whatever questions we have or we can answer for you. And again, the bottom line is we're all trying to create resources for both our clients and the other folks in the franchise ecosystem. We know that we are all in this together, and we will absolutely get through this on the other side. We just hope we can make sure that as many people come through successfully so that they can thrive on the other end. And with that, I really appreciate your time and attention. Have a wonderful afternoon. Enjoy your weekend. Hopefully you can figure out a way to make your weekend feel different from your weekdays, and have a great rest of the month.